Thank you. Is the audibility a little better? Yeah, we're good. Okay. Thanks so much, and what a pleasure to be here, and very honored also to celebrate Michael Walzer's honorary degree, and somewhat daunted by following him. But very honored also, and want to express gratitude to Petar and Sonia and Jovan, who've been so very generous in their hospitality. My topic is the guilt of war, and I will speak somewhat unconventionally. I am a moral philosopher, but in this work, in my recent work, I've really been interested in the moral psychology of war, trying to reconstruct how soldiers morally understand and conceptualize the experience of soldiering and its moral residue. I speak as one who has not put on the uniform in a country right now where only about 1% of the population are fighting, so the civilian-military divide is very exacerbated, and perhaps that's part of the reason that I feel somewhat of an outsider, but yet an insider, in that I've spent time at military academies. The topic has deep origins that came to light, and I think the origins were unconscious until recently. My dad died just this past December, just as I was bringing out this last book, and as I was cleaning up his effects in the hospital room, I found his dog tags in his pockets. He had carried them for 65 years. I never saw them. I was a very close daughter, and he never really shared them with me. And like many of that generation of World War II veterans, he was laconic about his war. It was a private burden. It was not something to share with a family in any way. And interestingly, he was a medic. He crossed the Atlantic about 16 times on the Queen Mary, which was a converted comfort boat, a hospital ship. He never discharged a firearm in war, but like many soldiers, he assumed this enormous personal responsibility for his involvement in war in a way that actually far exceeded his actual moral accountability. He held himself responsible as a way of trying to impose moral order on the ravages of war. And the dog tags sort of symbolized his way of holding on to what he could do to make sense of the moral engagements. He wasn't traumatized by war. I had an uncle who was, but my dad wasn't. In general, he was very candid about his feelings, but of war, he did not speak. And yet the dog tags were something he needed to sort out for himself, by himself, in order to take moral ownership, not just for what he did, but for what he saw. So I suspect I kind of inherited something of a legacy, and unconsciously, trying to understand what he left unsaid. And as a civilian in a world, in the States at least, where so few fight, I also feel that. The second set of reasons are far more academic than autobiographical, and that has to do with what I perceive as a gap in the literature. And put simply, the subject of a soldier's moral emotions has been largely ignored in the literature. From the philosopher's side, there has been enduring and renewed interest, largely thanks to the work of Michael Walzer, on just war theory. But despite that revival in the interest of justification, there's been deafening silence about the moral contours of soldiers' inner moral psyches, the interior battle space that they occupy as they fight external wars. So in a certain way, this is actually still in the tradition, I think, of Michael's work, that I'm interested in the moral reality of war, but the moral psychic reality of war, with attention to the hard and gritty cases and examples of soldiering. It is a kind of moral psychological casuistry, looking at case studies through actual voices and testimonies of soldiers. I interviewed about 40 soldiers in doing my recent work. Now, I've often thought to myself, and many have thought, well, this really is psychology. It's more clinical psychology, not really philosophy. But if you look carefully at a lot of studies of war trauma, particularly of post-traumatic stress disorder, and also now traumatic brain injury, mild traumatic brain injury, traumatic brain injury being the signature injury of the current wars that soldiers are bringing home. Typically, the focus is on the subject as patient. It's the idea is that this is a doctor-patient relation, and the public may understand some of what goes on, but by and large, what soldiers carry is private. So it's in part to redress that understanding that I engage in my own work. I think what's also missed in the discussion is that psychological injury is often moral injury. Psychological anguish is moral anguish, and feelings like guilt and shame are felt by the soldiers I spoke to, and I've read about certainly, when soldiers do no wrong by war's best standards. The feelings come with war. They're ubiquitous, and they're not just responses to committing atrocities or war crimes. And that's what the soldiers I spoke to wanted to have understood, that they felt the difficulties of bearing war without necessarily being victims, wounded warriors or victims of post-traumatic stress disorder or having committed crimes. What I felt expressed was that the feelings were feelings a good soldier bears in part as a testament to his or her moral humanity. Feelings, as I say, not always captured in trauma, acute or chronic, at least when it's stereotypically understood in terms of symptoms like hypervigilance or reliving experiences, reliving trauma through flashback or through nightmares, or numbing, a disconnection or dissociation that really compartmentalizes the war experience and makes reconnecting difficult. So this brings me to the subject of the work. It's a kind of, as I say, philosophical casuistry, ethnography, rooted though in Aristotle and his project of Tithenata phenomena, of grasping the particulars. But also, I should reveal my hand, I have had some psychoanalytic training, and so I'm not a clinician, but I've listened to soldiers in long interviews trying to understand, the arc of combat, what it's like to put on the uniform, deploy, and return home. As some put on the uniform, they talk to me about kind of conversion experiences, a crystallization of a new kind of identity, and the difficulty of what I refer to as border passing, of moving back and forth into civilian life from soldier life. Some have talked to me about the difficult feelings of having to fight for comrade and not cause, especially when one feels, and these are very powerful moral terms that came up, suckered by the higher echelon, as one of my interviewees put it, or another soldier put it, tainted, a strong feeling of being tainted as he served in Vietnam, and very much having in his own mind to separate cause from comrade. Others talked to me very painfully about payback, about revenge, Achilles style, fury, that they both exulted in as they retold their stories. It was almost hard to follow the transcript because the headiness and giddiness of the payback was so strong. But they also felt reviled by it at the same time. And in my mind especially was one young sniper in Afghanistan who had just seen a friend gunned down. He was totally overwhelmed by a swarm, a beehive swarming almost soldiers of the Taliban, and he, very injured, killed the guy that had just killed his friend and was aiming at him. And he had retold the story with this adrenalized, ramped up feeling, but also backed off with disgust about his own feeling. It's a job, it's an awful job. And he sort of just quietly went into himself talking about it. I've also interviewed interrogators in war and tried to understand a little bit the complicated moral shadowland that some occupy, even when there's no torture at all, but interrogation, slow, rapport-building interrogation, doing what you're supposed to do morally, building rapport in order to exploit it. And a student that David and Judy know, who I've come to know very well over the past 4 years, was a former Army interrogator in the cleaned-up Abu Ghraib. And he talked to me at length about examples that bothered him, and I still was somehow expecting more than I heard, but he said what really bothered him. He gave me 3 examples that frankly disarmed me. In one case, he had a Sunni and a Shiite. They were desperate for recreation time after isolation. He gave each of them recreation time, but he gave it to them together. And he said, as he arranged for this, I knew they were just going to sit there and hate one another, and he was putting pressure on them. And still, it didn't sit easily. The second case, he kept turning the screw on a detainee that was stonewalling him about extramarital affairs. And the detainee sort of cowered with shame and began to talk. And the third one, there was a detainee who fell in love with him. This intimacy that he created and then exploited was hard for him to live with. So there was a sense of being in role but never very far from his other role. But what gripped me most as I listened to soldiers was a sense of guilt. It was often the elephant in the room. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't easily articulated. It was born with some sense of shame, but it often filled soldiers, warriors' thoughts. And when I say soldiers, it was Army, Marines, Air Force, and seamen. And it took 3 principal forms that I want to detail and spend my remarks primarily on. The first I called accident guilt. And some soldiers blamed themselves for mishaps in equipment that took the lives of their buddies or the lives of innocents, though there was no negligence or culpable ignorance for which they could be held morally or legally responsible. So in a sense, it was a kind of irrational guilt. In one case, a wrenching case, the gun on a Bradley fighting vehicle, an armored vehicle, misfired, blowing off most of the face of a private who was standing guard. It was outside. It was in the green zone outside the palace in Baghdad. And the accident was caused by a faulty replacement battery. After lots of research and scouring around for an Army battery, one couldn't be found. A Marine battery was used. It was thought to be just fine. It had the same voltage as the Army battery, but a different amperage. And that made all the difference, because when the driver turned on the Humvee, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the current skipped right to the turret, and the turret went off and blew off the face of a private. So this officer describes to me a little bit how he feels, and then he talks about his sense of personal responsibility. He graphically describes with every riveting detail the incident. I won't turn to that. But then he turns to his feelings of responsibility. And he says, well, I'm the one who placed the vehicles. I'm the one who set the security. As with most accidents, I'm not in jail right now. I wasn't egregiously responsible. Any one of a dozen decisions made over the course of a 2-month period, and none of them really occurs to you at the time. Any one of those made differently may have saved Private Mayek's life. So I dealt with and still deal with the guilt of having cost him his life, essentially. There's probably not a day that goes by that I don't think about it, at least fleetingly. He was one of the few interviews who actually used the word guilt. As I was thinking about this, of course I thought about Greek tragedies, the trachiniae, and sort of misunderstandings about what a special potion will do or not in getting you across a river, and whether. But I was also thinking very much about agent regret, the idea that Bernard Williams and Tom Nagel talk about, referring to the idea that one's causally implicated in certain kinds of accidents, though not morally responsible, in virtue of something one intentionally did. And so you have not a spectator's sense of regret, but a very deep kind of regret called agent regret. Listen to these soldiers. Regret didn't even begin to capture, even agent regret didn't begin to capture the phenomenology of what the soldiers were talking about. It didn't capture the despair, the depth of the feeling, the weight of self-indictment, and the need to make moral repair in order to be allowed back into a community in which this particular soldier felt somehow his standing was jeopardized. When he says he wasn't egregiously responsible, he means that he knows he didn't commit a careless blunder. But he still doesn't think of himself as fully morally cleared. And in part, I think there was definitely a sense of betrayal of solidarity. There was a sense in which he had extra duties of care to his soldiers, which he felt he left undone in some sense. Others I spoke to talked about luck guilt, a kind of generalized form of survivor guilt. And survivor guilt, as most will know, is itself a relatively new term. The phenomenon is old. The term is not. The term was introduced into the psychiatric literature in 1961, referencing the severe guilt felt by survivors of the Holocaust. And those who survived Hitler's genocide felt that they were the living dead. And they had this unconscious belief they carried that merely remaining alive was a betrayal of the dead. Now, like accident guilt, strictly speaking, survivor guilt is not rational guilt. It doesn't track culpability. Surviving the Holocaust, surviving battle is not typically, in the cases I was looking at, in these cases of luck guilt, because a person deliberately let another take his place in harm. To be sure, it may be like that. Achilles' guilt, if we can call it that, over the death of his beloved war comrade Patroclus is perhaps one of the earliest records we have of a soldier's survivor guilt. And in this case, Patroclus was killed to reconstruct the moment because Achilles refused to fight. He dug his heels in, and Patroclus was killed wearing Achilles' armor and doing battle for him. And what Achilles wants more than anything else is to undo the original switch, to trade places not just in fantasy, but in reality, to suffer the harm and endure the death himself. So he says in the Iliad, "My spirit rebels. I've lost the will to live. The man I love beyond all other comrades, loved as my own life, I've lost him." He can't undo the switch, and he feels this profound guilt and, of course, also rage, anger that leads to desecrating Hector's body. But the guilt of surviving war buddies, of not being exposed to exactly the same lethal dangers is not always typically like this. It's often a matter of dumb luck. The soldier makes it out alive, and tragic luck that others don't. And yet many who have the good luck feel that it is a betrayal of those who don't. A betrayal, as I said, of solidarity. And in this regard, it's not unlike what's sometimes felt in a family when one sibling does well and another doesn't. The child who succeeds may feel guilty, experienced as if some finite distribution of goods is misappropriated based on a zero-sum game. To do well means that she's deprived in some non-innocent way her sibling of limited goods. And so in psychoanalytic literature, Arnold Modell describes aptly this kind of guilt as being in mental life a kind of unconscious bookkeeping system, a system that takes account of the distribution of the available good within a nuclear family, so that the current fate of other family members will determine how much good one possesses. If fate, he says, is dealt harshly with other members of the family, the survivor may experience guilt. And I think soldiers, as a result of very tight unit cohesion that allows them to fight well, have similar unconscious thoughts that the cost of their good luck is another soldier's bad luck. To be lucky is almost to actually deliberately deprive a buddy of comparable good fortune. Though they do no wrong, they blame themselves as a way of sharing the ill fate. Sharing the evil is a way to try to negate the awful sense of betrayal. Soldiers at Walter Reed Hospital, where I did a number of interviews, that's the flagship Army hospital in the Washington, D.C. area. Soldiers who were themselves severely wounded felt guilty for not suffering more, or visibly with limb loss or facial disfigurement. Their good luck was a betrayal of those who lacked it. And what they felt at bottom in this sense of betrayal is something, I think, that's empathic distress of the sort that I've been helped in understanding by thinking of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, British object relations psychoanalyst, where she describes guilt felt for injury and harm that's inseparable, inescapable from empathic love. And in her view, again, sort of reconstructing a childhood story, she probably over-reconstructing it, but it's a useful analogy. She says, we preserve as a residue from early childhood the anxiety, very primitive anxiety, that we have hurt and persecuted, physically damaged the very objects that we depend upon for nurture and love. So in her view, guilt isn't, as Freud thought, rooted in anxiety about doing wrong and fear of being punished for that, the archetypal castration anxiety. Rather, it's rooted in a different kind of garden story, if you like, or not so garden story, from the experience of harming or betraying what one loves and depends upon. Back to soldiers, in their own eyes, those I interviewed felt they failed to take care of their buddies. They had broken the bond of solidarity, and even worse, failed to honor the duty of fidelity that enabled them to fight in the first place. So one very moving interview was by an intelligence officer who was part of a lead battalion that on March 23rd, 2003 took catastrophic losses in Nasiriyah, Iraq. 80 were killed, another 80 were wounded in one day, enormous losses. But what made the incident even more horrific was that attack came just days after a rescue operation where this particular group was dealing with a freshly ambushed convoy. And again, catastrophic losses there. 2 months later, in mid-May, the same unit that Major Mooney's part of goes back to Nasiriyah, now not for fighting, but for peace and stability operations. And they're going exactly back to the exact same site where they had lost 80 and where they had had a rescue operation of a convoy. And this particular major describes to me what he feels as he's going back, and he uses the word jittery, a very somatic term, you might say, and word brace, you'll hear it. He says, I remember driving into the city from the north this time, almost flinching, bracing as we're going down Ambush Alley. Because I remember the last time I was in it, we were still seeing the charred marks on the road where we lost amphibious tractors. Catastrophic kills where every Marine in the Amtrak was killed in action. There's a battalion-wide memorial service on the very fields where the Marines had fallen, incredibly important as part of the collective grief work in these wars, and a lesson learned from Vietnam where that was not done immediately and in timely ways. But as soon as there was this particular memorial service, this individual, Mooney, gets orders to report back to the Naval Academy. And he left well before the rest of his regiment would be returning slowly back to the States. He's put on a commercial airline, familiar to many of you here, but for Americans who don't serve, the dissonance isn't quite, we don't quite register the dissonance that these soldiers are experiencing. Commercial flight, sitting next to civilians who he experienced as occupying a totally different world. And the rupture's palpable. And so he says to me, I didn't have the same experience or opportunity as other Marines. I had to get quickly home, shuttled back from Kuwait City on a British airline, then into Landstuhl, Germany, and then Frankfurt, and then he says, I'm at National Airport. He says, it was an interesting dynamic being transitioned so quickly. Boom, boom, boom. That's how he says it. And so I say, well, have you been able to manage with that transition? And he doesn't waste any time, and he says, yes, ma'am. And then he says, he thinks a bit, and he says, just for me personally, I don't think there's a day that goes by that I don't think about those times. And the word he uses, again, veiled because of the incredible loss of potential of marine life. And he speaks regularly to me then about loss of potential. And there's this steel-like comportment, but he has this sense of guilt about being in tranquil Annapolis. He's ready to go back, and he is preparing his new wife. He had returned to Annapolis to meet a future wife. He's now preparing her for going back. And he says, I say you've got to prepare yourself, because after sitting here in Annapolis for 3 years, after wonderful air conditioning in Annapolis, while my brothers and sisters have been out there on their second and third tours, he's now on his fourth. He's in Afghanistan now. You need to come to grips that I'm going to be away for a while. And as I was listening to this, my mind went to World War I and literature I know fairly well. I was thinking about Siegfried Sassoon, a complicated individual. Some of you may know, he talks to Bertrand Russell, who confirms his own views that Siegfried Sassoon can no longer really support the war. He might be court-martialed and executed if he's forward about it, candid about it. He gets put into Craiglachart outside Edinburgh, a psychiatric hospital through the manipulations of Robert Graves, his friend. He's treated by a Freudian-inspired doctor, Captain W.H. Rivers, and throughout his protest, he still is longing to go back, and in fact does go back to the front. And he writes these poems about abandonment and banishment. I'm banished from the patient men who fight. They smote my heart to pity, built my pride. And then he writes another one called Sick Leave, concluding with the battalion whispering to Sassoon, when are you going out to them again? Are they not still your brothers through our blood? So there's, again, a sense of betraying a solidarity and no other way to easily repair it except to return. The most troubling kind of guilt I heard about had to do with accidental or a guilt felt for collateral damage, an ugly term, but either unintended killings but that were yet foreseen of innocents, or accidental killings of civilians. And it was particularly hard when children were involved because of the raw vulnerability. And I'll describe one case that I've thought about. One Marine colonel commanded a battalion just south of Baghdad during Operation Iraqi Freedom II, and he told me that his Marines became devastated when children were killed when cars ran the trigger lines at checkpoints. If the injuries or deaths were of adult men whom they suspected were suicide bombers or women who might be concealing explosives under their burqas, his Marines, as he put it in his words, generally fluffed it off and justified it to themselves rightly or wrongly. And he said they would reason counterfactually. Even if I couldn't find out, it could have been this or it could have been that. But when children were involved, he said, there was a dramatic psychological difference. And his Marines would rush to medevac the children at their own risk. In one case, a unit couldn't go on fighting. It had to be pulled from the front. And I was thinking about this just in terms of our current troops in Afghanistan and if you like, the moral fallout of the surge. These current Marines are under much more restrictive rules of engagement than the Marines that I spoke to in 2005 and 6 and 7. And these current Marines and soldiers are under orders from Stanley McChrystal that it's the general in Afghanistan that the preponderance of risk is to be on the troops, as it ought to be. Michael Walzer with Avishai Margalit repeating the message of really unjust wars has made it clear this time in the connection with Gaza, where he writes, Walzer writes, soldiers must intend not to kill civilians, and that active intention can be made manifest only through the risks the soldiers themselves accept in order to reduce the risks to civilians. Soldiers I speak to see it from a different point of view. Obviously, they grumble about rules that force them to tie their hand behind their back, and they while appreciating the importance of winning the hearts and minds of a population, they grumble about whether or not the fellow Afghanis are doing enough fighting and whether indeed they're supporting what they view as an increasingly corrupt government. But part of what they also acknowledge, and again, this is sort of a descriptive point, is that the rules are in place also to protect their own hearts and minds, especially when they're involved not just in fighting, but they're involved in policing operations, community organizing. Many feel as if they really are the moral cop. They are the moral legislator trying to build civic and moral order. And to fail to do that, or at least to seem to fail in the face of a child only years younger than many of these boy warriors, or in the case of older soldiers, could be the face of their own children, is devastating. And when the child is killed, they feel unrelenting guilt. And I have talked to pre-deployment clinicians at Uniformed Services University, where I sometimes lecture, and what the clinicians find it hardest to deal with are soldiers coming home who return to their families and who see in the faces, projected in the faces of their own children, the children that they've killed. So rational or reasonable guilt. Nietzsche is the modern philosopher who understands this kind of subjective guilt so well. He says, bad conscience can become tortured without end, undoing any prospects of happiness. And he suggests that subjective guilt doesn't grow in the soil where you would most expect it. He says, such as in prisons, where there are actually guilty parties who should feel remorse for wrongdoing. Rather, it's often a question, I quote, of someone who caused harm, who causes a misfortune for which he's not fully. So this is obviously the theme of Freud as well, enduring the recriminations of a harsh superego. A bad conscience is the cost of civilization. And essentially, the moderns are documenting what ancients like Seneca in De Ira and On Anger warned long ago about outward-facing rage. The fury of revenge can leave its possessor more tormented than satisfied, and so too the fury of self-directed anger, of self-directed guilt. I often thought, and have thought, that I could turn to Kant for understanding the anguish of these kinds of inner struggles. After all, Kant formalizes Socrates' dictum, to know thyself, for Kant becomes the first command of all duties to oneself. And for Kant, of course, the spotlight is on me, on what I have done or failed to do, and not on others. It's the first person morality, the categorical imperative. The moral law for humans is a stance of personal self-judgment. But despite this first-person stance, Kant doesn't really stress in his moral phenomenology the bite of bad feelings. And that word bite, the morsis, is right there in much of the Stoic literature. The absence is deliberate. Kant's focus is on the mature conscience. And the attitude of that conscience is not punitive pain or fear, but respect or reverence, Achtung. And the attitude and a kind of attention or submission to our own authority as moral legislator. The idealized emotion we feel before genuine moral authority is dignified. It's not cowering. Indeed, when the subject of repentance comes up, Kant warns against a morality that's cheerless, morose, and surly. A self-punishment, he says, that becomes self-torture. Beware of hypocritical self-loathing, he says, and essentially the moral melancholy that detracts from the real work of morality. And in this, Kant intones against his pietist upbringing. True virtue ought to be cheerful and soar with a sublimity of reverence for its law. But my view is that Kant really doesn't appreciate the fact that harsh self-judgment is not necessarily self-loathing or self-righteousness. It can be inseparable from empathy for those we harm and a sense of responsibility and duty, and from the desire to make reparations, even when the harms are unintentional or intentional and warranted, but no less loathed, as in justified killing in war. That self-judgment and sense of responsibility, even guilt, may be redemptive, a way of reconnecting with one's full humanity, as the soldiers I spoke to felt so acutely. For what they longed for was a way to feel whole, even if the cost of that was feeling profound guilt. So that sense of feeling whole is something that Montaigne often worries about, and he says the price is too high. He famously compartmentalizes role. His role is public and private office. Famously, the mayor and Montaigne have always been separate. I quote again, "I know some who transubstantiate and metamorphose themselves into as many new beings and forms as the dignities which they assume. They're prelates down to their guts and livers, and uphold their offices even on their lavatory seat. I cannot make them see the difference between hats doffed to them and those doffed to their commissions, their retinue, or their mule." So essentially he's saying, as soldiers often do, salute the uniform and not the person. Separate them. There's language in mask, as the great American sociologist Irving Goffman put it. There's ritualized social interaction, and there's the role, which is very much a matter of outer decorum.